The noise of the restaurant was a living organism. Cutlery clinking against fine porcelain, the discreet whisper of conversations worth fortunes, the soft creak of polished shoes on the honey-colored marble floor of the Grand View terrace. Beatrice Rivers glided between tables as if she had been born there, with the tray balanced on her shoulder and a meticulously calibrated smile. That smile that cost nothing, and that she had learned to use as a shield. 26 years old, a former law student at the London School of Economics, second in her class in property law, and a waitress. She didn't allow herself to think like that when she was in the dining room, because the thought hurt, and the floor was slippery for those who walked distracted. But on that Tuesday night, as she carried 2 plates of mushroom risotto to table 12, something different was in the air. An electric tension she only recognized from one place, from classrooms where a case study could ruin an entire company. Table 23 was the most reserved in the Grand View. It was on a mezzanine separated by an intricately carved wooden screen, accessible only by invitation from the maître d' himself. Beatrice had served that table 3 times in 2 years, always the same signs. Men in suits who didn't consult the menu, still mineral water, and the feeling that every word spoken there was worth more than she would earn in 6 months. That night, table 23 was occupied by Richard Cavendish. She knew him by the name every property law student in London knew, the builder of the Regent Complex, the Harbour Arts Centre, the Minerva Tower. 72 years old, white hair combed back, dark eyes that seemed to calculate returns while looking at anything. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and, without saying a word, made everyone else remember they were younger, more inexperienced and cheaper. Next to him, 3 men in identical grey suits, whom Beatrice immediately identified as lawyers by the way they arranged papers on the table, with the anxious precision of someone paid by the hour. The one speaking was the oldest, a man with a trimmed moustache and a voice that sounded like a verdict being read. "The due diligence is solid, Mr. Cavendish. 3 firms reviewed it. The land is clear." Beatrice arrived silently to collect the empty water glasses. It was part of the training, to be invisible. The clients at table 23 didn't see waitresses. They saw moving furniture. That's when she saw the blueprint. It was open on the table, an immense document folded into quarters with the red stamp of a city council. It was the land's blueprint. Beatrice recognized the shape immediately because Professor Alistair Thorne, the most eccentric of the teachers she had had, used blueprints like that in his classes. He called them confessions on paper because any land with a history holds in its design the sins no one wants to remember. She was about to walk away when her eye stopped. In the lower left corner of the blueprint, almost lost under a fold of paper, there was a symbol, a wavy horizontal line with 2 dots above it. It was small, faded, printed in an ink that time had rendered almost ghostly, but Beatrice knew it. Professor Alistair had drawn that exact symbol on the blackboard one Thursday afternoon, 3 years ago, while the class yawned. He called it the haunting of urban backlands, the symbol of historical easement for a channeled waterway. It meant that an ancient stream ran beneath that land, protected by municipal legislation, and that no permanent structure could be built over it. Beatrice looked at the blueprint again. The symbol was exactly in the strip that, according to the construction sketch drawn next to it, corresponded to the position of the skyscraper's support pillars. She stood still for 2 seconds that felt like an hour. The lawyer with the mustache was still talking about schedules and transfers. Richard Cavendish looked at the document with that heavy silence that very rich men cultivate as an art. And the 3 lawyers in grey suits were absolutely certain that everything was fine. Beatrice returned to the kitchen with the empty glasses and stood by the sink for a moment she herself couldn't measure. Her heart was beating differently. It wasn't emotion, it was recognition. Danielle, her colleague on shift, passed by her and murmured, "You're pale, is it the heat?" "No," Beatrice said, "it's something else." She placed the glasses on the dishwashing conveyor and stared at the white tile in front of her. She thought of her mother, Susan, who woke up at 5 in the morning to take her blood pressure medication before going to work at the neighborhood greengrocer. She thought of the rent due in 12 days. She thought of the grades from the semester she had deferred, kept in a drawer like a guilt she nurtured every week. Then she thought of the symbol, AP 12, That was the designation Professor Alistair had mentioned, she was almost certain. Channeled Waterway Preservation Strip Easement, designation AP12, Municipal Decree 8, 471. Construction on the strip prohibited, penalty for non-compliance. Immediate embargo and a fine equivalent to 200% of the project value. If that skyscraper were built on the strip, there would be no negotiation possible. The city council would embargo everything, and if the project was worth what she imagined it was worth, the fine could destroy any company. Beatrice took a deep breath. She looked at the dining room. The problem wasn't the information. The problem was her. She was a waitress. They were elite lawyers. If she walked into that room and said she had seen something they hadn't, the most likely outcome was that they would fire her, with dismissal coming even faster. But the other possibility was worse, and she couldn't get it out of her head. What if the man who was about to sign that agreement lost everything because of a symbol she recognized, and that none of the 3 lawyers there had noticed? She picked up her order pad and a pen. She wrote in small letters, AP12, Channeled Waterway Easement, Decree 8, 471, check the lower left corner of the blueprint. She folded the paper into quarters, just like the blueprint. She held the paper for 3 minutes. Then she put the paper in her apron pocket and picked up a pitcher of water. She walked towards the mezzanine. The lawyer with the mustache was in the middle of a sentence about delivery clauses when she approached the table. She began to pour the water with the steady hand she had trained not to tremble, even when trembling inside. "Excuse me," she said, in a voice she didn't immediately recognize as her own. Everyone turned to her. It was the kind of interruption that didn't happen at table 23. "I need to say something about the blueprint on this table." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes storms. The lawyer with the mustache leaned back in his chair with an expression Beatrice could only describe as the face of someone about to say something cruel with polite words. Richard Cavendish, however, didn't move. He just looked at her. Those dark eyes that calculated everything remained fixed on her face for a second that was worth more than any words. "Are we to take zoning advice from the service staff?" said the lawyer with a smile that wasn't a smile. Richard Cavendish raised a hand, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. The lawyer closed his mouth. "Speak," Richard said, looking at Beatrice. And Beatrice Rivers, former law student at the London School of Economics, waitress at the Grandview Terrace, placed the folded note on the marble table and began to speak about the ghost everyone else had ignored. She didn't tremble. That's what surprised her most as she spoke. Her voice came out clear, organized, with the cadence she had trained during 2 years of moot court in university, those simulated trial competitions where you learn to defend the indefensible with the calm of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. She described the symbol. She mentioned the decree by its number. She located the symbol's position on the blueprint with her finger without touching the paper, just pointing because she had learned that in certain rooms, touching other people's documents without permission was a mistake people didn't forget. When she finished, there was a different silence at table 23. It was no longer the silence from before, full of certainty and condescension. It was the silence of someone mentally rereading something they thought they knew. Richard Cavendish looked at the blueprint. Then he looked at the 3 lawyers. "Mr. Fabian," he said to the one with the mustache in a completely neutral voice, the kind of neutral that is more frightening than any shout, "is this here?" Mr. Fabian leaned over the blueprint. His face changed color in stages that Beatrice observed with a coolness she hadn't expected from herself. She left table 23 without being dismissed and returned to the kitchen. Her hands, which had remained steady the entire time, began to tremble only when she placed the pitcher of water on the counter. Danielle was next to her again, this time with the expression of someone who saw a car accident in their rearview mirror. "What was that?" Danielle whispered. "I don't know yet," Beatrice replied, and it was the purest truth. It was 11 o'clock when Richard Cavendish's phone rang on the desk of the improvised office he had set up in the Grandview Terrace's private dining room, 3 floors above the main restaurant. The call was from himself. He had dialed. Beatrice learned this later when the pieces began to fit together. At that moment, she was in the kitchen doing the shift inventory. counting used napkins as if it were the most important thing in the world, because she needed something mechanical to hold on to what she felt inside. Alistair, the maître d', appeared at the kitchen door with an expression she had never seen on him, and Alistair was a man who had seen it all in 30 years of fine dining. "Beatrice, Mr. Cavendish wants to speak with you." She stopped counting napkins. "With me. With you. Now. In the private dining room." Danielle, who was behind her folding tablecloths, let out a quiet, "Good heavens," that sounded more like a prayer than an exclamation. The Grandview Terrace's internal elevator had mirrors on all walls, and Beatrice saw herself multiplied as she ascended. A white apron with a tomato sauce stain she hadn't been able to completely remove. Hair pulled back in a hurried bun, with 2 strands escaping. Orthopedic shoes she wore because standing 8 hours a day in any other model was a spinal problem waiting to happen. She didn't look like a person who was about to enter a room where fortunes were decided, but she had entered one before, apron and all, and had said what needed to be said. The private dining room was a rectangular room, lined with dark oak panels, with a long table in the center and a window overlooking Oxford Street below, a river of never-ending lights. Richard Cavendish was standing by the window with his phone to his ear when she entered. He didn't turn immediately. She waited. "Rupert," he said into the phone, with the same neutral voice she had heard at the table downstairs. "Tell me one thing and tell me now. The AP12 designation, Decree 8, 471, the channeled waterway easement on the Regent Street plot. Does it exist or not?" There was a pause. Beatrice couldn't hear the other side, but she could read the silence. It was the kind of silence of someone being woken up in the middle of the night and slowly understanding the gravity of what was being asked. Richard turned to her while still listening to the answer. He looked at her with an expression she took a second to identify. It was respect, not the performative respect of someone who treats a subordinate well to appear kind. It was the functional respect of someone who recognizes competence in a place where they didn't expect to find it. "Understood," he said. "Thank you, Rupert. Yes. First thing tomorrow." He hung up and looked at his phone for a moment. "Rupert Maxwell," he said without looking at her. "City Planning Secretary. Incorruptible as granite and just as charming. I worked against him in 3 licensing processes." A pause. "The AP12 easement is real, it's active. There's no exception, no negotiation, no bribe that works. And it's exactly where you said." Beatrice remained quiet. "My contract with Leonard Ferris," he continued, now turning completely to her, "has a penalty clause of £125 million if construction doesn't start on the stipulated date. Signing was scheduled for the day after tomorrow." He paused. "Do you know what would have happened if I had signed?" She knew, but she let him continue. "Ferris knew about the easement. He always knew. He was selling me a trap disguised as the deal of the century. Richard walked to the table and rested both hands on it. I would have signed, transferred the money, construction would have begun, and then someone, anonymously, would have reported it to the city council. Immediate embargo, astronomical fine, penalty clause triggered, all at once." He looked at her. "In practical terms, my business group would have collapsed in 90 days, and Leonard Ferris would have bought my assets for a fraction of their real value." The silence that followed was different from all the previous ones. It was the silence after the storm, when people are still understanding what just didn't happen. "How do you know what you know?" he asked. Beatrice took a deep breath. "I studied property law at the London School of Economics for 2.5 years before I had to defer my studies. I had a professor named Alistair Thorne. He was obsessed with what he called ghosts in the deeds, ancient restrictions, forgotten easements, decrees no one rereads because no one thinks they still apply. He would draw the symbols on the board and say that any professional who didn't recognize them immediately didn't deserve to sign a property contract." Richard looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Why did you stop university?" "My mother got sick. I needed to work." He nodded. He didn't say "what a shame" or "I'm so sorry," which were the responses people gave when they were actually thinking about something else. He simply registered the information as relevant data. "My legal team," he then said, has 18 years of collective experience in property law. 3 firms did the due diligence for this deal. None of them saw what you saw in 30 seconds looking at a blueprint while collecting glasses. He paused. That tells me one thing about them, and another thing about you. Beatrice didn't answer. I have a meeting at 8 tomorrow morning with the entire legal team. He picked up a business card from the table, a simple card, with just his name and a number. I want you there at 9, an hour after them. He extended the card. Not to give me more legal advice, but so I can tell you what I've decided to do with the information you gave me, and what I intend to do with you. She looked at the card. Then she looked at him. What if I don't show up? She asked, not as a challenge, but as a genuine question, because she needed to know what was at stake. If you don't show up, nothing happens. You go back to work tomorrow afternoon and I never mention this conversation again. He spoke without irritation, without pressure, like someone who is accustomed to making offers that are accepted, but who understands that the value of an offer lies in it being a real choice. But I think you will show up because you didn't write that note and walk up to my table by accident. You made a choice. And someone who makes a choice like that usually wants to see where it leads. Beatrice took the card. In the mirror elevator descending, she looked at herself again. The tomato stain on her apron, the undone bun, the orthopedic shoe. She looked, for the first time in a long time, exactly who she was. That night she called her mother after her shift, sitting at the bus stop with Richard Cavendish's card between her fingers. Susan answered on the second ring, with that voice of someone who had been sleeping lightly since the doctor had changed her medication. Daughter, are you well? I am, Mum. Beatrice looked at the empty Oxford Street at midnight, cars passing slowly. I think something happened today. Good or bad? Beatrice stared at the card. Richard Cavendish, Cavendish Group, a number. I don't know yet, she said, but I think I'll find out tomorrow morning. She hung up and waited for the bus. She didn't sleep well that night, but it wasn't from anxiety. It was because she stayed awake rehearsing what she would say the next morning, organizing what she knew, reviewing what she had seen. When the alarm rang at 7, she was already up, her mind clearer than it had been in months. She didn't know what Richard Cavendish had decided to do with Leonard Ferris's trap, but she knew that whatever the decision, a war was being prepared, and that she, in some inexplicable way, was at its center. The Cavendish Group occupied the top 4 floors of a building in Canary Wharf, one of those dark glass buildings designed to remind people that the world has hierarchies. Beatrice arrived at 8:50, 10 minutes before the agreed time, because she had learned from Professor Alistair that in any negotiation, the person who arrives last rarely controls the pace. The receptionist on the 28th floor was an impeccably dressed young woman who looked at Beatrice with the professional courtesy applied to visitors whose status had not yet been classified. Beatrice Rivers for Mr. Richard Cavendish. He's expecting me at 9. The receptionist checked her schedule, confirmed, and her face changed in an imperceptible fraction, from neutral courtesy to something closer to genuine attention. Beatrice had learned to read that sign. It meant her name had been specially marked in the schedule, different from common appointments. She waited in a meeting room with a view of the city, with coffee no one had ordered but which appeared anyway, and tried not to overthink. At 8:15 she had heard, not intentionally. The meeting room was separated from the main office by a glass door that wasn't completely soundproof, and voices came through muffled but recognizable. It was Mr. Fabian, and he wasn't happy. With all due respect, Mr. Cavendish, what happened yesterday was a circumstantial misunderstanding. The blueprint we received from Ferris's office had a reduced scale in the printed copy. The symbol was below the minimum readable resolution and... Mr. Fabian, Richard's voice clear even through the glass. How many years have you been in the property market? A pause. 22 years. And has the blueprint scale been a problem before? Another pause longer. No. Then the problem wasn't the scale, the problem was something else. And I prefer not to name that something else in front of the entire team, out of respect for the time you've spent here. The silence that followed was so dense that Beatrice could feel its weight through the glass. At 9 o'clock sharp, the door opened and an assistant called her. Beatrice entered the main office, which was large and had the long table from the previous day replicated here on a larger scale, with leather chairs and a discreet LED panel on the wall. Richard was sitting at the head. The three lawyers in grey suits were sitting on the left side. But there was something different about them now. Their posture had changed. They were no longer the men who controlled the room. They were men awaiting a sentence. Beatrice sat in the spot indicated by the assistant, on Richard's right side, facing the legal team. Mr. Fabian looked at her. It was a look she knew. It was the look of someone who is angry with themselves and needs a place to put that anger. "Last night," Richard began without preamble, "I confirmed with the city planning secretary that the AP12 easement is real and active. This means that the deal that was about to be signed was a trap. Leonard Ferris knew about the easement and planned to let us sign, transfer the funds, and then trigger the municipal embargo." He looked at the team. "The due diligence cost £380,000 and lasted 6 weeks. It didn't find what a former law student found in 30 seconds. Mr. Fabian opened his mouth. Richard raised his hand. "No, today is not the day for explanations. Today is the day for decisions." He looked at Beatrice. "Based on her information, I spent the night preparing a countermeasure. At 7 this morning, my personal assistant contacted Leonard Ferris to inform him that we detected a technical inconsistency in the documentation and that we needed an urgent meeting before signing." A calculated pause. "Ferris accepted the meeting. He thinks he's going to a last-minute negotiation. He doesn't know we arrived with the evidence." Beatrice remained quiet, but inside something was reorganizing like pieces on a chessboard. "The new agreement," Richard said, "was negotiated this morning before this meeting. Ferris, confronted with the technical report of the easement and with the secretary's confirmation, had no way out. The alternative was a lawsuit for fraudulent omission of relevant information in a property deal." He opened a folder in front of him. "The land was acquired for £300 million below its original value. Ferris absorbs all project redesign costs, estimated between 50 and 60 million, and the agreement includes a confidentiality clause that protects our market position while the project is adjusted." The silence in the room was of a kind Beatrice had studied in theory. The post-plot twist silence, when people are still processing the change of direction. "This is possible thanks to her," Richard said, looking at Beatrice with a simplicity she found more impactful than any elaborate compliment would have been. Then he looked at the legal team. "And for that very reason, as of this afternoon, your firm's contracts are terminated. HR will contact each of you for the procedures." Mr. Fabian was so quiet, he seemed to have stopped breathing. Beatrice felt no triumph. She felt something stranger, a kind of weight, because she had understood, back in the restaurant kitchen the night before, that by opening her mouth she was putting those people in a difficult position. There was no pleasure in it. There was only the recognition that some truths have a cost, and that the cost doesn't change the fact that they needed to be spoken. The legal team left. Mr. Fabian was the last. At the door, he turned and looked at Beatrice for a second she wouldn't soon forget. It wasn't just anger, it was something more complex. The face of someone who recognizes at a very late moment that things could have been different. When the room was just her and Richard, he opened a drawer and took out an envelope. "I investigated your story," he said. "I spoke with the London School of Economics Coordination, with Professor Alastair Thorne, who, by the way, told me you were the most rigorous student he had had in 10 years. A pause. "You left university because your mother needed you. That's not weakness, it's responsibility." Beatrice looked at the envelope. "A check would be an insult," he continued. "What I have to offer is different. It's an investment." He opened the envelope. "I will pay for your university tuition in full until graduation. Tuition, materials, housing if needed, without immediate quid pro quo." He paused. "But after graduation you will come work with me as a personal advisor. Specific function, finding the ghosts, the forgotten easements, the buried clauses, the symbols no one else knows how to read, because apparently someone does." Beatrice stared at the documents for a moment. "Why not hire another top lawyer? With the resume you can afford, you'd have better options." Richard leaned back in his chair. "I had 3 top firms, paid to find exactly this." A minimal pause. Clarity of vision isn't a matter of resume, it's a matter of how a person looks at things, and now I know how you look. Beatrice thought of Susan, of the rent, of the grades locked in the drawer. She thought of Professor Alistair drawing symbols on the board while the class yawned. She extended her hand across the table. "We have a deal," she said, and for the first time in many months, she didn't need to calibrate her smile. She left the Canary Wharf building at 10 in the morning, with an envelope in her bag and the weight of a decision that had taken 2 years to find its way. The November sun beat down on the pavement with that dry London intensity, and the city seemed different. Or perhaps she was different, seeing the same streets with different eyes. On the Underground, she took out her phone and sent a message to Danielle. "Not coming in for my shift tomorrow. Got something to tell you later." Then she opened her mother's contact and typed only, "Mum, the thing that happened yesterday was good." She waited a moment. Then she added, "We're going to be okay." The bus back to Islington dropped her 3 blocks from home, as always, and she walked the same uneven pavement as always, passing Mr. Linnes's newsstand, Mrs. Connolly's bakery, the wall with the blue cat graffiti someone had painted during the pandemic and never touched since. Everything was the same, and everything was different. She didn't know yet, as she pushed open Susan's iron gate that morning, that the biggest discovery was still to come, that the ghost she had found on the blueprint was only the first, and that there was another, much deeper one waiting for her in the pages of a thesis she hadn't even started writing. The last semester of university was different from anything Beatrice had imagined when she deferred her enrollment 2 years earlier. She returned in March with a full scholarship and a purpose that didn't need to be explained to anyone because it was visible in every choice she made. The front rows, the notes in the margins of the books, the questions she asked at the end of classes that the professors took longer to answer than they had planned. Professor Alistair Thorne hugged her when she returned, literally. A disjointed and emotional hug that caught her by surprise in the law faculty corridor on a Monday smelling of stale coffee and photocopies, and which she later remembered as one of the most genuinely good moments of that year. "I knew what you did at the restaurant," he said, pulling back and looking at her with that glow of a teacher who discovers that a student has used something taught in class in the real world. "Cavendish called me, personally. Said a former student of mine had recognized the AP12 on a blueprint and saved £1 billion deal. £500 million, actually," Beatrice said. "After the adjustment." Alistair laughed. "Irrelevant detail. The point is, you used what you learned here. And that means I wasn't just talking to myself in that room." "You never talk to yourself," she said. The whole room listened. Some just had their eyes closed. He looked at her with an expression of a satisfied teacher and never mentioned the subject again, because he had learned in 30 years of teaching that the best compliment a teacher can receive is a student who no longer needs compliments. Beatrice decided her thesis would be about corporate espionage in the property market. The panel approved the topic without enthusiasm, because it was an arid and technically complex subject, and that was exactly the kind of challenge she had learned to seek. She started with bibliographic research, then public cases, then documents that the Cavendish Group had shared with her during the negotiation process, with express authorization for academic use with altered names. It was on a June afternoon, with her laptop open on the library table and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, that she found the lead. She was reviewing the deal's timeline, mapping each document, each date, each movement. And that's when she saw, 3 months before presenting the land to Richard Cavendish, Leonard Ferris had acquired a small company called London City Archives. The company was in the process of winding down operations. Its assets were basically physical archives of blueprints and zoning documents from past decades, and the amount Ferris paid had been negligible, less than a 2-bedroom apartment in Clapham. At the time, no one had paid attention. A dying company bought by an investor who collected troubled assets as a hobby. Irrelevant. Beatrice stared at the document for a long moment. Then she typed the company name into the Companies House public record system. The London City Archives had been founded in 1974 and had specialized its entire existence in digitizing and cataloging municipal zoning blueprints, ancient deeds, and registry documents from the pre-computerization period. It was, in practical terms, a repository of everything that had been forgotten, buried, lost in the drawers of a bureaucratic system that had changed technology before finishing migrating the past. It was exactly the kind of place where someone could find an ancient channeled waterway easement, catalogued in 1962, and never transferred to the municipal digital system. Beatrice opened a new tab and searched the list of former employees of the London City Archives, registered in the National Insurance records for the past 2 years. It was a laborious search, which took 3 days, and the help of a computer science classmate she had met at the university canteen. But on the 3rd day the name appeared: Mark Henry Villiers, legal assistant. Dismissed from the London City Archives in August, 2 months after Ferris acquired the company. Hired in September, 1 month later, by the Cavendish Group's law firm, the same firm as Mr. Fabian, the same firm that had conducted the due diligence for the deal. Beatrice stared at the name on the screen for so long that the letters lost their meaning. She went to the library bathroom, washed her face with cold water, looked in the mirror for a moment and returned to her table. Then she opened a new document and began to write. Not the thesis, not yet. First, she wrote a report, 6 pages, clean, organized, with every piece of information documented, every date verified, every connection supported by a primary source. She had learned in Alistair's classes that the difference between a suspicion and proof is the chain of documentation. And she had the chain. Mark Henry Villiers had been hired by someone in Mr. Fabian's firm, someone with access to the recruitment process and to task allocation in the due diligence. And Villiers, who had spent years cataloguing the zoning blueprints of the London City Archives, knew exactly what the AP12 meant. He knew how to read the symbol. He knew where it was. He had not made a mistake during the due diligence. He had committed a deliberate act to bury the evidence. She wrote the report title last. The Ghost Had Help. She sent the file to Richard Cavendish that same night at 10 o'clock, with no comment in the email body. Just the attached file and a subject line she thought about for 10 minutes before writing, "Relevant discovery. Read when you can. It's urgent." Then she closed her laptop, picked up her bag, and left the library door with the strange feeling of someone who has just thrown a stone into a lake and is waiting to see the ripples spread. Her phone vibrated before she reached the bus stop. It was a message from Richard's personal assistant. "Mr. Cavendish asked me to inform you that he received the material. He will call tomorrow morning. He also asked me to relay the message that, direct quote, 'She never ceases to amaze.'" Beatrice reread the message twice. Then she put her phone away and walked through the London night with a slightly firmer step than she had left with that morning, because she had discovered something that years of restaurant work and years of university and years of bills and sacrifices had not managed to take from her. The instinct of a person who knows they haven't yet found the bottom of the problem and won't stop until they do. She didn't know yet what Richard had done with that information during the night. She didn't know that he had called his trusted lawyer at 11 at night, that the two had spent 3 hours reviewing every page of her report, and that by dawn a folder had already been prepared for the Serious Fraud Office, with every document organized in the order a prosecutor would need to see. And she didn't know that Leonard Ferris's name, who had tried to destroy an empire with a faded symbol and a bought assistant, was about to appear in a place from which it was not easy to escape. What she knew was enough to sleep for the first time in a long time, with a quiet mind. At 6 the next morning, her phone rang. It was Richard. She answered, still half asleep, sitting on her bed in the room she shared with the books and notebooks and photocopied blueprints she had accumulated throughout the semester. "Good morning," he said. His voice had that calm of someone who has been awake for hours. "You found the link I hadn't found. The connection between Ferris's company and the internal assistant. I spent the night verifying." A pause. "It's all correct. Mark Villiers was paid to suppress the information during due diligence. I have bank records of an account that received 4 transfers during that period. He disappeared off the map in November, residential address non-existent, cell phone cancelled." Another pause. Shorter. "With what you discovered and what I confirmed, we have sufficient proof of conspiracy and corporate sabotage. It's enough material for the Serious Fraud Office to destroy Leonard Ferris completely and irreversibly." Beatrice was silent for a moment. "And you're taking it to the SFO?" she asked. "Already did. This morning, at 5:40. A minimal pause. "I want you to know that what you found wasn't luck. It was method. And method is more valuable than talent, because talent appears once. Method appears every time you need it." She held her phone after the call ended, looking out the bedroom window where the morning was still grey and the city was still waking up. She thought there was a word Professor Alistair always used when a student finally understood what he was teaching. A simple word, used with surgical precision. The word was now, as in now you understand, now you see, now you know. And Beatrice Rivers, on that Tuesday morning in Islington, with coffee yet to be made and graduation 3 weeks away, understood that the now had arrived. The London School of Economics graduation ceremony happened on a Friday in December, with that dry end-of-year heat that turns formal attire into a test of endurance for everyone involved. The Bloomsbury Theatre was packed, families in the stands with cameras raised, graduates lined up in black gowns and mortarboards. That specific smell of rented academic attire that no one can dissociate from the anxiety of important occasions. Beatrice was in the third row. Susan was in the stands, in the spot Beatrice had reserved weeks in advance, one of the best viewing angles of the stage. She saw her before going up. Her mother, in the blue dress she had spent 2 hours deciding which to wear, with her phone already raised in camera mode, with that smile that was the only one Beatrice knew that needed no calibration. Professor Alistair was at the faculty table, in his eternal beige jacket, and a tie that seemed never to have been washed. And when Beatrice passed through the row to take her place, he made a discreet nod that she knew how to interpret immediately. It was the gesture of someone who is proud and thinks that showing too much would diminish the solemnity of the moment. She didn't need more than that. The dean called the names in alphabetical order. Rivers, Beatrice Almeida. She went up to the stage, shook the hand that was extended, received the diploma with her right hand, turned to the camera someone was pointing from the stands, and descended from the stage with the awareness that she had done something completely different from what any diploma records. She had arrived. Not in the way she had planned at 18. By a path no planning would have foreseen, full of restaurant shifts, overdue bills, an apron with a tomato stain, and an almost invisible symbol in the corner of a blueprint. But she had arrived. After the ceremony, as the university courtyard filled with hugs and camera flashes, Susan found her and stood in front of her for a moment before speaking. "I'm so proud of you," she said. Simple as that. No drama, no prepared speech. Beatrice felt her throat tighten but kept her smile. "We made it, Mum. You made it. I just stayed here. Staying is enough. Staying is everything." They stood like that for a moment in the crowded courtyard, with the December heat beating down on everything, and then went to lunch at a local cafe in Notting Hill that Susan had chosen because the pastries there are the best in town and graduation calls for pastries, a logic Beatrice found irrefutable. The following Monday, she went to the Cavendish Group for the second time, this time without an apron. In a grey blazer, she had bought at a second-hand clothing store in Brick Lane Market that fit better than anything she had found new within the same budget, with her diploma in her bag because Richard had specifically asked her to bring it. The receptionist on the 28th floor recognized her this time without needing to check the schedule. "Good morning, Dr. Beatrice. Mr. Cavendish is waiting." "Doctor." She paused for a second with the word. Richard was standing when she entered, which she later learned from assistants was not his usual behavior with visitors. He was by one of the windows overlooking Canary Wharf, but this time something was different in the office. One of the side doors was open. She had never seen that door open before. "Congratulations on your graduation," he said without the handshake protocol he used in formal meetings, more direct than that. "May I see the diploma?" She handed it over. He looked at it for a moment with the attention he gave to any important document and then returned it. "Sit down." She sat down. He remained standing, which she had learned was how he processed thoughts that required movement. "When you sent me the report about Villiers," he began, "I spent 3 hours checking every piece of data. Not because I doubted you, because I needed to understand how you got there. He looked out at the city through the window. You mapped the timeline, found the acquisition of the archives company, cross-referenced it with recruitment records, identified the interval between dismissal and hiring, all with primary sources, all documented. A pause. This is not what a newly graduated lawyer does. This is what an experienced investigator does. Beatrice remained quiet, waiting. The Serious Fraud Office opened an inquiry against Leonard Ferris this week, based on the material I provided, which included your report as a base document. He turned to her. Ferris's name will be out of the game for years, which means the land eventually will change hands again. And when that happens, I want to be first in line. That will take time, she said. Everything worthwhile takes time. A pause. But in the meantime, there's work. I have 4 deals in due diligence right now. 2 of them on land with history prior to 1980, which is exactly the period when the digitization of municipal documents was most flawed. He looked at her. So. He walked to the side door that was open and pushed it completely. On the other side was a smaller room with a desk, 2 chairs, an LED panel identical to the one in the main office, and a window overlooking the same piece of the city. It wasn't a meeting room, it was an office. Next to mine, he said simply. Beatrice stood in the doorway for a moment. The room smelled new, that smell of paint and newly installed air conditioning. On the desk was an open zoning blueprint, large, with the red city council stamp she recognized as the type of document that had changed her life on a Tuesday night in a London restaurant. She entered. She walked to the desk, looked at the blueprint, began to examine it, her eyes scanning the lines with the slow precision of someone who knows exactly what they are looking for and is in no hurry to find it. Richard stood in the doorway, observing. "Is there something here?" he asked after a moment. Beatrice tilted her head slightly, the right corner of the blueprint, a line that should have been continuous and had a subtle, almost decorative interruption that wasn't decorative. "Perhaps," she said. "Give me half an hour." Richard nodded and closed the door with the discretion of someone who understands that important work needs silence. Beatrice sat in the chair, pulled the blueprint closer, and began to look for the ghosts. She worked for 40 minutes, not half an hour. Richard didn't come in to check on the deadline because he had learned in his 2 previous interactions with her that the person who knows what they are doing doesn't need a clock as pressure. When she opened the door, he was at his desk with 2 documents in front of him, and he looked up immediately. "There's a front setback limit inconsistency on Lot 3, she said with the partially folded map in her hand. "It's not an easement, it's more subtle. The boundary line registered in the land registry does not coincide with the city's blueprint line. The difference is 1 meter and 80 centimeters. It seems irrelevant, but it affects the entire plot's utilization coefficient. The project you have designed for that lot is oversized by 14%. Richard remained motionless for a moment. 14%, he repeated. 14.3 to be exact. He picked up his phone and dialed. While waiting for the call to connect, he looked at her with that expression she had learned to identify as his version of calculated astonishment, the expression of someone who is surprised but doesn't let the astonishment outweigh the function. "It's the second time you've saved me from a problem no one else saw," he said, before the call connected. "Third," she said. "But who's counting?" Richard smiled. It was a rare smile from him, small and genuine, the kind that isn't for anyone specific, but happens when something clicks in a way one hadn't expected. Then he returned to his call, and Beatrice returned to her office with the blueprint, with the issue not yet completely resolved, with the work that still needed to be done. She didn't know, as she sat down again and pulled the blueprint closer, that in less than a week she would receive a message from Professor Alastair saying that her thesis had received the highest grade from the panel and that one of the professors had asked permission to use it as teaching material. She didn't know that Danielle, her former restaurant colleague, would call her that weekend to say she had gotten an interview for an administrative job, and that Beatrice's letter of recommendation had made a difference. She didn't know that Susan, at the neighborhood greengrocer, was telling Mr. Linus from the newsstand and Mrs. Connolly from the bakery that "my daughter works with Cavendish now," the one from the Harbour Arts Centre, with a mixture of pride and disbelief that was her version of happiness. All of that was yet to happen. For now there was the blueprint, and the work, and the window overlooking the city that never stopped. And that was enough. 6 months later, Beatrice had developed a rhythm. She arrived at 8:15 before Richard. She made coffee in the 28th floor kitchen, which she had discovered no one else did right because no one else arrived before 9. She took her cup to her desk and opened the first document of the day. Always a blueprint, always a zoning history, always that slow, methodical hunt for what time had hidden. In those 6 months, she had found 4 more inconsistencies in the Cavendish Group's land documentation. None were a ticking time bomb, like the AP12 on Regent Street. They were minor problems, the kind of problem that would have gone unnoticed for a few more months and then appeared at the worst possible moment, as unresolved problems invariably do. But each one she found was a problem that didn't need to be managed in crisis, and Richard had learned very early to measure the value of prevention in a way most executives don't learn until they pay dearly for the lesson. One May afternoon, she was reviewing the documentation for a plot in Chelsea when Richard appeared at her office door with an expression she had learned to classify as news with consequences. "The SFO has concluded the first phase of the inquiry against Ferris," he said. "Formal indictment. The press will pick this up tomorrow." Beatrice was silent for a moment. It wasn't a surprise. She had followed the process closely, through the folder of documents Richard's lawyer shared with her monthly. But hearing the formal conclusion had a different weight than anticipation. "And Villiers?" she asked. "He cooperated. He's in a leniency agreement. He returned what he received, gave a full deposition, and will face charges out of custody." Richard paused. "That's what happens when you're the weakest link in a chain and have a lawyer who knows how to negotiate." Beatrice nodded. She thought of Mark Henry Villiers, who had been hired to suppress information and whose name she had found in a national insurance record on a library afternoon. She thought there was no way to know from the outside what led a person to make such a choice. Probably a combination of things that rarely appear in an inquiry: financial pressure, illusion of impunity, the belief that the world of big business operated by different rules than those that applied to others, mistakes that were understandable in their origin and disastrous in their consequences. "The land will go to auction when the process concludes," Richard then said. "Probably in the first half of next year. I intend to be first in line. It will need a new design. The original skyscraper doesn't work with the easement." "I know." He looked at her. "That's why I want you to start studying project readjustment options starting this week. It's not architect's work yet. It's work to understand what legislation permits within the easement strip and what construction configurations remain viable." A pause. "You'll need to dive deep into the municipal law of 2019 and subsequent decrees." "I've already read the decrees." He stopped. "When?" "In March, when I started here. I thought they would be relevant sooner or later." Richard looked at her for a second, with that expression of a smile that wasn't completely a smile but came close. "Sometimes," he said, "I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't worked at the Grandview Terrace." "I would have gone to another restaurant," she said without drama. "And who knows what would have appeared on another restaurant's table?" He laughed. It was an unusual sound from him, brief and genuine. "Do you believe in fate?" "I believe in method," she said, "which sometimes looks like fate because it produces results that seem impossible." He nodded once, like someone registering a useful definition, and returned to his office. Beatrice returned to the Chelsea blueprint, but she paused for a moment with her pen still on the paper, thinking about what she had said. Method. It was the word Professor Alistair used when he wanted to distinguish knowledge that served as decoration from knowledge that served as a tool. Method was the chain that connected the symbol on the classroom blackboard to the almost erased symbol in the corner of a blueprint in a luxury restaurant. Method was what had transformed a perception into a certainty into an action, and an action into a chain of consequences she was still discovering. She thought of everything that had happened since that Tuesday night. She thought of the folded note she had put in her apron pocket and carried to table 23. She thought of the hand that had remained steady while her voice came out clear. She thought of the faces of the lawyers in grey suits when the blueprint was reread. She thought of the phone Richard had dialed late at night to an incorruptible secretary. She thought of the office that had been opened for her next to his, with a blueprint on the table waiting. And she thought of something she had understood only gradually over those months, in a way that didn't fit in a note or a 6-page report, that the most valuable person in a room isn't always the most obvious. That knowledge kept in drawers, locked away with the grades of a deferred semester, remains knowledge. That a symbol doesn't disappear because no one sees it. It waits, with the patience of paper, for the eye that has learned to read it. That the ghosts in the deeds only haunt those who don't know what they are. For those who know, they are something else. They are clues. That afternoon, as the late afternoon light streamed through the window and gave the Chelsea blueprint that golden quality that made everything slightly unreal, Beatrice thought of Danielle. She had called the previous week, excited about her new job, and had said something that kept echoing. "You always seemed to be somewhere else when you worked at the Grand View, as if your head was in some other world." Beatrice had responded with a laugh, but then she thought about it. She wasn't in another world, she was in the same world, just seeing more things than the situation required, which was sometimes the same thing. An eye trained to search cannot turn off when it enters a room, no matter what the room is or what you are carrying in your hands. The eye searches, and sometimes it finds. That's what she had tried to explain to a second-year London School of Economics student who had waited for her after an informal lecture with the question, "What if I don't get the opportunity to be in the right place at the right time?" Beatrice had thought for a second. You'll never know where the right place is until you're there. That's why you learn everything you can now, even what seems useless. Especially what seems useless. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from Susan. A photo of the framed diploma that had been hung on the living room wall of her Islington home, next to the graduation photo. Beatrice looked at the image for a moment. The frame was simple, dark wood her mother had carefully chosen. The diploma itself was a document like any other, a piece of paper with a name, a date, a stamp, but what it represented was what didn't fit in the frame. The shifts, the bills, the apron, the photocopied blueprints, the cold coffee in the library, the note folded into quarters. She sent a heart emoji to her mother. Then she put her phone aside and returned to work. There was a line on the Chelsea blueprint that wasn't behaving as it should. It was subtle, the kind of thing that would go unnoticed if you didn't know what to look for, or if you were looking with the right eyes but the wrong attention. Beatrice leaned over the desk, pen in hand, and the concentration that came from within, from that silent place where method resides, and began to look for the next ghost. If Beatrice's journey touched something within you, if you've ever felt you carried knowledge the world hadn't yet recognized, leave a comment below telling your story. Stories like Beatrice's exist in each of us, waiting for the right moment, the right table, the right symbol that someone brave decides not to ignore. If this chapter reached you, share it with someone who needs to remember that the most valuable potential is not always in the most obvious place. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories, because there's always another ghost waiting to be found, and the next guardian could be you.